This is the INI rig that we use for live shows, and in this video, we'll be diving into the software side of things where I'll show you guys how we set it up, how we set up our tracks in the DAW, and how we mix all of the inputs for our ear mixes. If you haven't seen part 1 of this rig rundown where I go through all the physical components and how they all talk to each other, you can check that video out up in the cards here or here. I always forget which one it is. I use Reaper as a live playback DAW, and that might come as a little bit of a surprise to some of you because I'm mostly known for using FL Studio. All the videos across the channel are mainly just me in FL Studio, and that is a little bit weird in itself because, you know, FL Studio isn't really like a metal DAW, but it's just the one that I'm used to, and you know what they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I do use Reaper Live, and the truth is I use it because I find it to be a little bit more stable. There's not as much bells and whistles going on in the back end. It's not as fancy, which is actually perfect for a live scenario because you want it to be as stable as it possibly can. That's the main priority with anything that we do when we play live. We just want everything to be super, super stable, and Reaper just works. So going into the actual session, we have the intro track. So between each song is like the ambience that plays. This set is pretty much designed to be like once we hit space and press start and start the set, like it just goes for, you know, 30 minutes. It doesn't get stopped at all. All the talking breaks, everything is like super concise. I rehearse that all the time to make sure that it's exactly the same experience no matter where we go. And again, it's just more stable that way. There's less things that can go wrong. We then have a ghost track. We have a bass and drum track, which is muted. That's just there in case something really, really bad happens, or, you know, one of the guys can't make it, or they get really sick on the day or something. Like, we can still get through the show, albeit not as interesting and not as fun to watch, but they are there just in case. Sound effects track, which is mainly things like, you know, weird ambience, you know, volume swells, sound effects, synths, all that stuff. Originally, that sound effects track was just a stereo image backing track, but recently I have split out the guitars from that backing track. So now guitars are on their own, which is why they're in this guitar track here. Again, that's just all the guitars that I'm not playing at any given moment. Any weird layers that are in the background, like stabby rhythm layer guitars or stuff like that, that, you know, no one on stage would be playing even if there was 7 guitarists on stage. They're just there in their own files. And that way, when Chris gets it at front of house, he can mix it separate to everything else, which has turned out to be really, really handy, and it's definitely leveled up the sound of our live mix for sure. We then have a subs track. So subs, again, are stemmed out separately, and that's so Chris can have a little bit more leeway and a little bit more freedom to do what he wants with the subs, whether he wants to crank it or run it in a little bit more subdued. The subs are separate so that he can mix them separately to the sound effects track. In green, we then have click track and call out. So as you can see, they are split out separately. The call outs are like really cringy. It's just me doing it in a microphone. I have listened to a couple INI mixes where it's like that computer voice doing it, but I just don't like that at all. I'd rather have just like a human element, and even if it is my voice, that's fine. So we kind of just do call outs like 4, 3, 2, 1 right before a big bit or right before a song is about to start, just to make sure that we're all 100% locked in, because it is very easy to get distracted when you're on stage. But then the click track is obviously very self-explanatory. It's just the metronome that plays in the background of every track. As you can see, there are some songs that have a lot more tempo changes than others. That's the beauty of the click track, is that it will always follow, it will always be consistent, it will always be stable. And then the last couple lanes are set up straight for MIDI. So we have 2 lanes of guitar MIDI and then 3 lanes of bass MIDI. So these yellow ones are mostly scene changes. So I have made a video on this in the past, and if you want to check that out, that'll be linked up here somewhere or up here. Again, I forget which one. But basically, the way we set up our quad cortexes is that we have a preset for each song, and then within those presets are different scenes for different tones. So for example, the start of Arrhythmia has like a clean patch at the start, and then scene B is the heavy patch, and then scene C is the lo-fi patch, so on and so forth. And that's all within the Arrhythmia preset. And then when the song changes, it'll switch preset and it'll be the same thing. We split it up because I obviously have a lot more scene changes going on when we're playing, because it is guitar music, so there's a lot more tones going on. Whereas bass is, you know, there's still lots of tones going on, but it's not as much as the guitar. So we split it out and we send them to separate channels through MIDI DIN ports on the back of the M32C. So then that way I get my scene changes completely separate to Kyanan's and all as well. Then the second lane here, just as it is here, there's some parts of some songs where there is whammy automation happening on the expression pedal MIDI. So I've just split that separately from the scene change MIDI because, again, I don't want them to get mixed up. I like seeing them separately. It makes me feel a little bit more confident when I go to diagnose anything, just in case something goes wrong. So that way, you know, this track is all whammy, this track is all whammy, and they're being sent separately to guitar and bass. And then the last lane here with these little MIDI inserts are bass tuner MIDI. So before this set, and, you know, like maybe like a year ago, a bit before that point, This set was a little bit different. We used to run different basses because I didn't have a dingwall at that point. I haven't had a dingwall for the entire time that we've been playing. But since getting the dingwall, obviously that is the main bass. But in saying that, you're playing that for the whole set, and we don't really run anything on stage. The only thing that's in front of us is the QC, but because everything else is on rails, Keyan requested that we put the tuner on rails as well. So as you can see, between each song, there's ample amount of time for the tuner to pop straight up so he can quickly tune his bass. A problem that I obviously don't have because I play Evertune guitars, and it's awesome that I don't need to think about that, but it is there for him, which is awesome, and it's so awesome that it's on rails as well. And if you want to see how I programmed any of that stuff, you can check out another video that I've done, which is a Quad Cortex MIDI programming video, where I go through exactly how to program MIDI to a Quad Cortex from a DAW like Reaper. So those are all of the lanes that we use when we play live, and they are again split out separately on all the outputs on our Play Audio 1U that I mentioned in the previous Rig Rundown video. So for example, you know, the main sound effects track or whatever is 1 and 2, the guitar track is 3 and 4, subs track is 5, so on and so forth. And that uses up every single one of the 12 outputs that are on the Play Audio 1U. As you can see, I kind of like having everything in order split up by markers, so then that way, in case something does go wrong, again, you're kind of always thinking about things that can go wrong. For example, if we have to stop a song halfway through, I can just hit 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, and it will take me back to the beginning of that song. So that's pretty much everything that's happening in Reaper. Let's take a look inside the M32C and see how we're processing these inputs for our ears, along with all the other live instruments. So this is the M32 Edit app for the PC, and we use this program to set our ears before the show, and then on the day, we do have this here, but I don't like opening this up on the day. We just have the iPad app version, and we kind of dial it in with the iPad if we have to. So pretty much all of the inputs are being used apart from one, this channel 18. I don't know what that's going to be, but it's there just in case we need it one day. But as we go through, in our ears, we are getting kick in, kick out, snare top, snare bottom, hi-hat, rack tom 1, rack tom 2, floor tom 1. Ride, China, overhead left, overhead right, and then we have triggers for all the shells, and this is just used to gate. So for example, within the gates in the kick channels, we sidechain it to the kick trigger so that it only opens when the kick trigger is hit. Same thing with the snares, racks, toms. It just makes everything really, really clean from a gating perspective. So kick trigger, snare trigger, rack triggers, I should say. Empty channel, like I said before. We then have stereo bass left and right, so we do have some patches within Keyan's bass tones that do have like a nice stereo image to them, so we keep them there. Guitar left and right. We have IEM track left and IEM track right, and that's basically just an amalgamation of both the sound effects tracks and the guitar tracks all in one. That gets summed into an IEM track left and right out of the Play Audio that's just for us, because we don't have enough inputs on here to have the tracks and the guitars separately, so we just kind of sum them into one and do it that way, because I'm not that fussed, but Chris at front of house definitely is, because it's much different when it's in a room and not straight into your ears. So that's IEM track left and right. We then have the ghost track, click, cues, my vocal. We then have a crowd left and right for ambient mics. If there are at the venue, we can get them patched into our rig through our split, and then we'll feed back into the M32 so we can get a little bit of ambience, bit of room going on. We then have a stage shout linked up, so if there ever is a situation where we're playing on a really big stage, there is a stage shout channel set there so that we can have a microphone with a switch that, you know, is for our crew or anyone else that will be near the stage, just in case anything goes wrong, so they can quickly say something and then we'll hear it, or Chris at front of house can hear it or something like that. And then last but not least is the talkback, which we have a dedicated line for, which is why it's labeled front of house talk to stage. As you can see, all of them have their own individual processing on it. I won't go into exactly the settings that we use because we'll just be here forever. But as you can see, if I go into the kick channel, you can see that all the gates are set, the dynamics are set, we've got EQ going on. And again, it's a little bit different to kind of mix signals that are coming from a live rig and a live setting for in-ears. Like it's a very different kind of way of mixing. I find that I'm much more, cutthroat in terms of like EQs that I cut out and whatever. Like if I don't need X amount alone, I just get rid of all of it, because things can build up really, really quickly. And all you really want when you have a live mix in your ears is just a really good representation of everything. You don't want to be thinking about like, oh, the ambience of the kick drum and stuff. Like, nah, just kick drum, snare, toms, only high end on cymbals, all that stuff. I find that brings out the best results. So it's really nice and clean. which you will hear in a moment. The tracks only have a little bit of EQ going on. Again, it's more kind of just like a safety thing, like a peace of mind kind of thing, where we have like, you know, a low cut and a high cut for things that don't necessarily need to be there, that will just cloud up around the kick and the bass and stuff like that, which again, if it was like a nice pair of headphones and I was listening to it for my enjoyment, I would keep it in there. But when you're playing live, like most of the stuff that we have in the in-ear tracks are in this mid-range area. So let's just accentuate that and just cut off all the stuff that we don't really need. Same thing with guitars, again, just a tiny bit of low mid cleanup and low and highs pass. I already mentioned this in a previous video, but you know, guitar and bass processing is pretty much happening within the quad cortex for the reason that, you know, there is backing tracks and they are just straight master stems. So we kind of want the guitar and bass tones to be pretty much a one-to-one representation of the tones that were mixed and mastered on each record. So then that way, when it hits front of house, they kind of all sit where they need to be in relation to the backing track. And then at that point, Chris's job is just to make sure it sounds good in the room, which he always does. Like, for example, again, that kind of like cutthroat EQing, like the crowd mics, the ambience mics, like all of that low end rumble that's happening from the crowd mics, like I just cut that out completely. Like we don't need to have that building up against the actual kick drum and the bass tone and stuff like that. If I can hear the crowd going like, woo, or whatever, like around this point in the EQ spectrum, then that's pretty much all we need to hear. We don't need to hear like the reflections and the bass build-ups in the corners of the room, especially when it's a small room. That would just be a disaster. So again, everything is like super mixed in. There's a lot of kind of different dynamic processing going on, some heavy compression on snares, kick drums, shell. Pretty much like the shells are pretty compressed. Like the overhead left and right are treated like, you know, like almost like a smash mic. Obviously there still is some transient detail, but again, you don't really want to hear the ping of a drumstick hitting a China cymbal in your ears. You kind of just want to get the idea that a China cymbal is being hit musically, if that makes sense. So all these inputs get mixed here, and then like I mentioned in the previous video, we have an in-ear transmitter for each of us, so that way we can have our own mix being sent to us and we can decide on the levels that we want for our own in-ear mix. So for example, Keyan left and right, I have everything pretty much level. My guitars are a little bit louder. Click is all the way up. I want to hear the click as much as I can, and the cues and stuff like that. But as you hear, my mix is pretty level with a little bit more emphasis on myself. Next up, we have Kyanan's mix, which is more of the same, but obviously instead of guitars, it's bass. So he hears himself heaps, which is awesome. And that way he can really lock in with the kick drum and the click, which is also turned up super, super loud. And then last but not least, we have Steven. So Steven, again, is less of me, less of Kyanan. He can obviously still hear us. It's just not as loud in the mix. Click is absolutely dimed, and he's got a lot of himself, but not as loud as you would think it would be, because again, he is right in front of the drum kit. So not only does he get like the tactile feedback of him actually hitting the shells and the cymbals, but you know, he gets the sound right in front of him. So it doesn't need to be as loud. There still is a little bit of bleed in our ears, even though we have them molded. One thing I want to point out on my mix bus, because I have the Shure 535 in-ear monitors, I have made an effort to EQ it on the actual output of my mix bus, and this EQ isn't completely random. This EQ was kind of taken from the Sound ID reference profile of these exact headphones. So if you haven't heard of SonarWorks reference or Sound ID reference, it's basically a program that sets an opposite EQ to whatever earphones that you're using, so that it can sound as flat as possible. And obviously, you know, not all in-ear monitors are perfect, so that's what I've got going on my mix bus. So basically all the inputs get fed into this, and then this EQ gets applied to kind of level out the pre-existing levels of my in-ears, if that makes sense. It's a really cool trick. It definitely does sound a lot better, not as hi-fi as you can tell from this massive cut that's happening over here. But yeah, for some reason these in-ears have a lot of like 7.5K, 7.6K but that all gets taken out. And then there's just like some cleanup over here. I did notice a massive difference when I had that in my mix. Future me needs to remember to turn that off before I film the in-ear mix for you guys. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all our inputs and how we mix them. It's not as in-depth as it could be. There could be, you know, things like a little bit of reverb and stuff like that set on the snares and stuff, which honestly, I haven't figured out how to do that yet. If there's anything that you guys see in here that you think would help us in our mix, definitely leave a comment and let me know, because I do want to dial this in even more. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, I'll catch you later. Peace.